Let's get it started. Huh?
Hey, what's up, guys? Welcome to the Deconstruction Zone. It's maybe, I think, episode 86, but it's been months, weeks at least, since an episode has come out, and things are going to look a little bit different. But before we get to that, I want to introduce the person that I'm hanging out with, who is going to be the new other voice here on the Deconstruction Zone, co-host, you might call him. Sadie Murbarger, introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Sadie Murbarger.
Yeah, you are. So tell people, so you've been on, how many times have you been on the Deconstruction Zone? Once or twice?
I've been on one time.
Okay, and we talked about purity culture, I believe, right?
Yes, yeah.
But
Kissed purity culture goodbye.
You kissed it goodbye. I thought it was a great episode for TikToking. I might go back and turn it into new ones. But you've been on once, but you're a friend of the pod. You also are connected to the church that produces the pod, so more than a friend of the pod. So tell people who you are, introduce yourself, whatever you think is interesting to tell people about yourself.
Okay, yes. I mean, my relationship with the pod is I would say, pretty involved because, Danny is my boss. Spoiler alert. My position is called the worship pastor, and I've been working at the well since before its launch, December 2021. I think my start date was the beginning of November. So I did a couple of the pre-launch services, and then we hit the ground running in December, and I've been here ever since. So our working relationship has been 2.5 years probably thus far.
I think that's right.
Yeah. And then with Emily, I think I want to tell the story of how you set us up to be friends.
Oh, I don't even know.
Do you remember?
I don't think I remember.
I think you had started a meeting with Emily about deconstruction.
Yeah, I remember her and we would get coffee at Panera, and when we had that co-working space, and she would ask me questions about why did Jesus have to die, or what's the point of the resurrection?
Super light conversation.
Yeah, light conversation.
Topics. But we were at Upshot in Cottleville, and Danny, you would come to me and you were like, "Hey, there's this girl. I really want you to meet her," because I'm new to the area, so you're trying to help me, connect and make friends and community and all that good stuff. And I think I social media stalked her before, so I could have an idea of maybe what she'd look like. I think the plan was you guys were gonna get coffee.
Oh, I do remember.
Yeah,
this now,
you guys were gonna get coffee. She didn't know there was a third person gonna be there. It was me. I was the third person, and so I'm in Upshot, I'm getting my coffee, and I'm it's pretty busy, so the only table available is actually directly next to Emily. And I'm just kind of looking around, and then Emily, she's so kind, is "Hey, do you need help? There's a chair here you can sit." And I'm she doesn't know that we're getting set up on a blind friend date right now, basically. Yeah. But then you guys met, and you're actually Sadie's here too, and she's gonna join us for our conversation.
Yeah, I do remember that was an ultimate fail of attempted to try to set people up, because I was I remember Emily and we weren't talking about anything secret, but I remember it was she was sharing certain things.
Yeah.
That I was she probably is just sharing this between her and her pastor right now.
Right.
And then you were there, and I was I definitely made this all happen, and now I'm trying to figure out how to transition between the two. That's why I totally forgot about that.
Right. Everyone was in good spirits about it, so it's really funny. And she's one of my closest friends now, so you obviously knew what you were doing to an extent.
I knew what I was doing to an extent. I could get that in a t-shirt. It's my mantra.
You could, and you should.
But speaking of Emily, and I'll reintroduce myself in a second, just because maybe someone is new to the podcast or doesn't know. But so Emily helped co-host for 80-something episodes. I think it was 85 episodes or so. And really, for the life of the pod up to this point, it's been a following of her journey, for lack of a better term. We've interviewed some people, we've talked about different topics, but in really high level view, we were journeying through her story, how she's processing through deconstruction. She grew up kind of more conservative, fundamentalist in the Reformed Presbyterian tradition, and began to ask questions about that and push back on that. And so if you're new to the pod, this is your first episode and you're someone journeying through deconstruction, I might say go back and listen, because her story and her journey, episodes 1 through 20 is like a very different vibe than 21 through 40 and like 41 through 80. They're all kind of different vibes in the season that she's in. But now, between you and I, we're not necessarily deconstructing either of us, but the hope here is to continue to walk alongside other people that are. And so whether it's having other people join us, or it's just us talking about some things that were difficult for us in deconstruction, or things that we're seeing, trends and whatnot, that's kind of going to be the vibe. So a little less like of our stories, maybe, though I think we'll weave our stories in, and a little more of a higher level view of what deconstruction looks like. I think that's a good way to classify what it's going to look like.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, we haven't recorded any yet with us, so I think we will see.
Yeah,
but, we will. Because, I mean, even in the conversations that we kind of just have normally without microphones in front of our faces, I think it will just kind of continue to flow on that direction.
Yeah. I will say a good Spotify for podcasters shout out. Like, that's a good sign if you're going to do a podcast. If you can just talk to someone without a microphone, you can probably do a podcast with them. So if it is your first time and I've not met you, or you haven't heard the pod before, my name is Sadie Murbarger. I'm the pastor of the church that Sadie was talking about, the lead pastor of the Well. And so her and I are the staff that kind of help run what's going on there. Sadie kind of handles worship and creative stuff, and kind of charge of vision and teaching and that sort of stuff. And yeah, I've been on this deconstruction journey, not necessarily for myself, those certain things I've deconstructed over the last couple of years, but walking with friends and whatnot, both Emily in the podcast, Sadie with you, and other of our friends. You and I have a pretty decent group of friends that are like either in the midst or on the other side of, or about to walk into deconstruction.
Right.
And so even outside of this podcast, I think deconstruction is kind of a big thing in our midst. And so I guess the first thing I would say to like kick us off is, when you think about deconstruction, Sadie, like, how would you describe it? Like, what is, if someone comes up to you, whether it's one of your old friends back home and they're like, I've never heard of this before.
Yeah.
How would you describe deconstruction to that person?
I think mostly I picture kind of someone's life. It kind of feels like the coming of age part of life, and that could be represented in like media in a lot of ways. But kind of, in my view, I think that deconstruction is like taking an assessment of all the things that you've like believed up until a certain point, and then kind of realizing that, or at least in my experience, that I really was a product of my environment. So it's like to look at all the things that I believe about the world and spirituality and God and theology, and just kind of ask myself, or recognize, like, I kind of believe these things because I was brought up a certain way. Yeah. And as you start to kind of unlearn, or actually just look at all of the doctrine or the aspects of theology and God that you believe, and then as you start to maybe understand that this might not be what I believe or I understand it or experience anymore, it's kind of like a relearning, or like a new learning. I don't know. I even see, we just experienced like baptism Sunday a couple of Sundays ago. Like, I think that the story and the model of deconstruction can be like represented in a lot of different ways, and even maybe like the baptism as you like go under in your but as you like come up from the baptism water, you know, if it's the immersion type, like you kind of shed maybe some of your old beliefs and you have new beliefs. And but it's a process. It's hard. Sometimes it's hard to describe, which is why I think this podcast exists, is because it's way more of a conversation.
Yeah, I like that the metaphor to baptism. Actually, I don't think we've used that one before.
It just came into my mind.
I like it because it is very much like that, right? Like, you're kind of above the water. It's like, this is what I know, and this is what I have, and you go under, and then you come up. Yeah, the things that like are loose or were never meant to stay attached kind of get washed away.
Right.
And we use that analogy all the time for sin and whatnot in baptism. And but I think it's very similar in faith. And I like, one of the things that I've commonly said through this is that it's a form of discipleship. Like, I think that it's a wholehearted pursuit of like wanting to know God better. Like, I and I'm sure there's someone out there, but like I know very few people in deconstruction that aren't taking their faith more seriously
Oh yeah.
than they ever have. And
Yes.
people that are in the midst of it that are asking big questions, not because they want to say screw you to religion or they hate the church, but because they love it so much that they want to like find a way to reconcile this kind of disconnected set of beliefs that they maybe felt that they were inherited or whatever.
Yeah, for sure. I had a thought. Ugh. I was just thinking, I don't know, it's like the coming of age as you start to realize the things that maybe the new beliefs that you're starting to kind of feel or seek out, new ideas, new thoughts, like feels more in aligned maybe with what you experience. Because I don't know, I kind of just talked about deconstruction in a really like romanticized way, but in reality, like there's a lot of pain that can sometimes happen, and like even crises of faith. Like it's not always just like, you know, oh yeah, I'm figuring it out. Like it can be very much more complicated than that.
Yeah, it's like, I mean, I would say it's very taxing. Like it's very hard to
Yeah.
go through, like whether it's you're deconstructing your thoughts on what you've been taught about human sexuality or heaven and hell or women in ministry, like, and there's so many other things, racial justice or any of those things, like every single one of those things and so many more are connected to something that will likely feel painful, even if it's like built into something new. Like the process of getting there is likely painful. And you said this earlier, like you kind of said in passing, like the idea of like inherited beliefs, right? Like that's what you were given. And this weekend at the well, so when this comes out, this likely won't be fresh. But up to this point we're recording, we're talking about faith and finances. And that's actually one of the things that I talk about or will talk about is like a lot of what we think about money, whether it's we look at it in like fear and scarcity or power and security or whatever it is, like that's probably an inherited belief. And I'm using the example of like my natural inclination is to spend money immediately because every Monday my family would go to a bowling alley for my parents' bowling league, and my parents would give me my allowance there, which was terrible because as a little kid I was like, well, I have to spend this immediately. Like they're giving it to me to spend on these arcade games. And so it took me a long time to understand that like money wasn't just something that I got immediately to turn around and spend, which is not related to deconstruction other than like, I think a lot of the things that we believe tracing back to like the origin story of like, well, why do I act this way? Or why do I believe this way? Or why do I think this way is kind of interesting. And I think sometimes we're taught, especially in more like fundamentalist or evangelical spaces, like there's that doesn't matter. Like it doesn't matter if you inherited it because it's the right way.
Yeah.
And oftentimes the things we inherited could be value neutral, but also could be bad, and some could be good. But I think looking back to the origin of things is probably helpful, especially in deconstruction. Like, where did I get this from?
Right.
And do I actually believe it? And even more than that, like, is it a good belief? Like, is it a Christ-like belief?
Yeah. It's a very, almost a scientific approach of like trying to maybe isolate something and be like, actually, why do I believe this?
Yeah.
This specific thing about my faith. I actually don't know specifically where it is in the Bible, but when I think about deconstruction, I really just think about like taking every thought captive, and that's somewhere in there. I don't know if you know where it is, but I don't.
I'm not that's one comment. I'm not a Bible quoter.
Yeah, me neither.
Well, one thing that I thought would be fun, because again, like we're just kind of like laying the groundwork in this episode. Like we're starting something new, and I'm excited about it. Getting this back off the ground. I miss podcasting. It's a lot of fun for me. Like conversation, a part of my week is something I seek out. And I think for a lot of our listeners, like that's what they've missed is not necessarily like getting more information or getting smarter or whatever, but it's like being a part of the conversation, even if they're not vocally in it. I think hearing the conversation makes you feel a part of it. And so I wanted to ask you, like, do you have any good experiences personally in deconstruction, like where you had a belief that you maybe inherited, you really examined it, you deconstructed it, and like rebuilt something healthier in its place? Do you have any stories like that?
So I'm pretty lucky that my overall experience of deconstruction, I guess inwardly within myself, was pretty gentle. I think like I didn't have a huge, what I would kind of call crisis of faith, like to where I was never like, I don't believe in anything, like blah, blah, blah. My deconstruction primarily happened at my Christian university. So probably from ages 18 to 22, 23. And it was just the process of my classes that I was in. We were just studying the Bible in a way that provided a space for like cultural context and almost a critique, but for the purpose of education and in a good way. And so kind of because of that, I started to look more critically about my beliefs. About it might have started kind of more political. I was like, oh, I don't really understand why I'm supposed to believe certain things about immigration when like I'm learning things about the Bible that seem very like pro-immigration and like pro-diversity. And then kind of women and gender justice kind of came along and was like, I don't understand why I wouldn't be allowed to do certain things because of my gender. And, you know, later then it was the LGBTQ community. My best friend came out to me and was like, I actually don't view this as a barrier with my faith. And, you know, recommended a book to me, and it prompted a lot of good conversation. And so inwardly, the deconstruction was very natural because I was just being exposed to an explorative type of study as opposed to someone teaching me the truth, and I'm just supposed to believe them because they have authority over me, instead of like the kind of discovery aspect. So that's like inwardly, deconstruction has been very positive. Outwardly has been much less so because of people's reaction to my kind of new beliefs.
Yeah, well, that's a good. So kind of positive on that. Like, have like when people have kind of come in a more negative light, like, is it? Because I'm always interested in how people engage with others in deconstruction. Like, are people frustrated because it's like you've left the camp? Are they like, or is it this is a heretical belief? Like, because I think a lot of it. Some people, if they did deconstruction in a vacuum, they would be like, "This is great,"
Yeah.
but it's often the voices.
Because it is,
yeah,
and it should be.
And often it's the voices outside of themselves that perpetuate whatever that narrative is. And so, and you could make a broad brushstroke. You don't have to be hyper specific, but what have some of those like negative voices been like? Because I know for you, like I make this joke every time you preach, it like quadruples our YouTube views and listens because you have a lot of hate listeners.
I do, yeah.
So what do you think it is that like bums them out so much about your deconstruction? Do you think it's just like because you left the evangelical family? Even though I would say the Well is evangelical in the best sense of the word.
Right.
Right. But you have left whatever that tribe was, or do you think it's like you're a heretic? Like, what do you, if you could speculate, unless you have the concrete answer, like, what do you think it is that bums them out so much or gives them so much desire to like hate listen and engage in that way?
Yeah. I was trying to think as you posed the question. It's been a little bit different based on the person, probably. Sometimes we'll just get heretic comment on or this is blasphemy comment on TikTok. So sometimes like I think if people are just want to be like haters or want to just drop, like, obviously, especially if they don't know us, they're not trying to be like, oh, I care about you and I want you to do this. So it's definitely a variety, like a spectrum of kind of responses and maybe even reasonings behind responses. So I think it can range anywhere from just a stranger dropping a comment to, I mean, whenever I was having the like gender equality discussion with one of the elders from my hometown, luckily it wasn't, most of the time the conversation was, it was very, very kind, but still kind of like oh, I'm concerned for you. Or sometimes it feels like people are hoping it's a phase that I'll get over, that they're just like, oh, she left her little hometown and, she's prodigaling it up right now, but maybe she'll come back one day. Home. Yeah. I think some of it has to come from fear. I'm in my social experiences, a lot of times, maybe less now, but for a few years, I was the first affirming or progressive Christian that certain people in my social circles had ever encountered. So I'm sure that there's maybe even a curiosity there. I mean, this one is really speculation, but like maybe even a jealousy of like why I almost wonder if people wish that their faith could be more accepting or progressive.
I think that's actually very true. I think a lot of people, they get frustrated about it. It's in some ways, I don't think they would name that, but like the way
no, they'd never name it.
Right. The way I think I said this to Emily early on, like what I thought was I was kind of seeing is people were somewhat jealous because it felt like she was getting the best of both worlds, which was like a God to worship and then a God that was loving. And it wasn't like a God that like hated everyone. And they're like, well, you can't have your cake and eat it. You're like, you can't have both of them. And I think it's so funny because it's like this picture we painted of God is not everyone, but like is very hateful, very vengeful. I was just talking to like my father-in-law, and he was like, I have a really hard time reconciling the God of the Old Testament with the God of the New Testament. Like, why is God so vengeful and hateful and all those things? I don't think that's a true characterization of the God of the Old Testament. I think there's like a whole story that's happening there. But I think some people cling on to those more aggressive character traits that we don't really see lived out very much in the New Testament. And they're like, well, this is, even though Jesus said all this stuff about love and grace and inclusion and challenge and all those things too, like we still want to go back to that wrathful dude that we read about.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's easier, right? It's easier to understand that you're in when you can say for sure who's out.
Yeah, right. I think that's also part of it. It's like if I can't tell you clearly that you're out, how the hell do I know if I'm in?
Yeah.
And like that's probably, so maybe even more than jealousy, it's like a security thing.
Oh,
like it's pulling away some of those things that make people feel secure. So I asked you about hard, right? That was the initial question, like hard about deconstruction.
Maybe, because I talked about how it was that inwardly it was pretty nice.
Yeah,
or natural, I guess.
So I guess whether it's in your own life or in someone else's life that you've witnessed, like where have you seen deconstruction really like bear fruit, if that makes sense? Like take someone where not asking questions and not doubting and not deconstructing maybe never would have took them. And maybe as you think about this, I'll use Emily as an example. Like I think had she not gone through this journey, now I think there could be radical debate on either side whether it should have be done in the public forum and in podcast version.
It was a choice.
It was a choice, and one that I fully support and affirm.
Yes,
I think was a good decision. I think it helped a lot of people.
Yeah, I think she's understanding now, like more of Emily's like social experience. I think she's like so brave and so real and authentic for like choosing and honestly, I think she's so generous to like share that part of her with everyone because, of course there's been a cost.
Yeah, there's definitely been a cost. And I think even if we're going to get like real scripture quotey on us, like I think Jesus says like there's a cost to discipleship.
I've counted up the cost and all my wealth is in the cross. I'm a worship pastor.
Yeah, you can
probably, I'm going to insert that in there just so people can understand.
I'll never sing.
Yeah.
But I would say like, so looking at Emily's faith looks very different. Yes. And there was definitely a cost to the journey. But I would say looking at her, she's a great example of someone that like came out the other side for whatever that means. Like that doesn't mean she's done and that doesn't mean she's like it you know what I mean? I think you know what I mean by that. But like I think her faith looks way different, but I would argue that it's stronger, at least in the truth of the things that she's holding on to, And so where have you seen deconstruction go well? And now that I used Emily as an example, you can't use her. So.
Okay. I can use myself. Because I kind of think about growing up and I was, mostly adolescent years. I was like told that I was supposed to feel like super excited and passionate about the gospel, but I would also kind of just be like, really, like, while I believe that God loves me, the majority of all the things that my spirituality was like feeling anxious if I was like right enough with God to where if I died that minute, like if I'd go into hell or heaven, because that was always like the big motivator and the big driver was like to make sure that my eternity was secure, basically. And I don't know, that's just like not a super good motivator for me. So I think that now kind of the spirituality and existing outside of that framework, now I actually understand when when people are like, yeah, sometimes if I just think about the gospel too much, you'll just like weep from joy. Like it's just such a better story than the previous story that I had been like living out. And I think it's like the most beautiful thing to like imagine that like the same God was with me like the whole time, that like even though while I was in a much kind of more anxious, fearful based spirituality, like that I've always kind of been heading this direction. I'm like so grateful for that.
Yeah, I think that's great. And I think it's true. It's like oftentimes people will paint the picture. It's like, well, deconstruction is like an abandonment of God. Or
Right.
It's like now I'm here
Or
and
a slippery slope.
a slippery slope. Or like now I finally found God. And I think that's a really important thing to point out to anyone who's listening, whether they're step 1 or step 100 or in between on the journey. It's like God's with you.
Yeah.
And it's like, though you see through the prism of faith and spirituality differently, like you're still looking at the same God. And ultimately God is with you. And Annie and I have just started, my wife Annie and I just started reading the Gospels to our kid. We read this like children's Bible, and they're like, these stories are so short. And so I was like, well, we can read like the real one, like out of the big kid Bible.
Yeah. The kid Bible.
And I was reading it, and like I like got like weepy last night because I'm like, I know the story, right? Like I know where it's going, and it's like here, like reading these things, and then having my kids intersect and be like, well, what does this mean? Or like they asked a lot of questions about heaven and hell, and then that made me sad because it's like that's not even the point of this conversation. Like we're like jumping to this whole. I told them, I was like, why don't you guys worry about the party now before you start worrying about the after party, is what I told them. But it's like the story.
I like that.
The story is so good and compelling, and like we were reading like the end of John's Gospel, 18 through 19, which is like pretty intense for kids' bedtime story. But I was like, they're all like asking all these questions, and like, well, why is Pilate doing this, and why are they beating up Jesus, and why are the priests like hating him? And like I'm trying to answer these questions, but then I'm getting emotional like trying to like get through, because I'm like, I know the good part of the story that's the end, and like they haven't heard that part of the story yet.
Yeah.
And so it's just interesting, like thinking about even inherited beliefs that we talked about earlier. It's like I'm doing that now, like I'm giving my kids things to inherit, and I'm like knowing that they will abandon some of them and keep some of them. And my kids both are in different places, 9 or 8 and 10 almost, on what they believe about God. And so it's like, how do I give them something healthy, knowing they're not going to keep it all, and knowing that they'll add stuff and that they will keep some. Like, and I have to imagine my parents maybe thought about that, but I'm trying to be really intentional. And it's an interesting season of parenting that I haven't been in. Like, those are the most spiritual conversations and Bible conversations we ever have with my kids, and so it's just interesting.
Yeah, I love that. This is a little bit of a deviation, but we can go. I think a lot of like children, and every time that I'm talking to a child, I think about like how actually important like whatever I'm saying is. And so I teach English to a family from Afghanistan, and well, mostly just the mom, but I hang out with the kids some too because they're my little buddies. But the oldest son, who is Knox's age, he like asked me one day, he was like, Sadie, do you like Allah or do you like American God? And I was like, well, first off, the second God that you mentioned is like not American actually.
Yeah, right.
But I know what you're talking about. And I like wouldn't give him an answer. I was like, oh, like I'm okay with like both. I don't really feel like I need to choose. And like his little mind is like, no, you have to choose. And I just like wouldn't. But I don't know. I'm just always thinking about how like I don't want to. I just think about, I don't know, as he grows up, it might mean something that someone didn't want to just like tell him that he's wrong about his faith.
Yeah, I even think about that, like between Allah and American God. Like, I think every kid has that, like, either or. Like,
Right.
even if it's a kid in the Christian faith, it's like, is it the loving God or the
Mm-hmm.
wrathful God? Is it the my faith or the, like, it's funny, like he inherited that thought from somewhere, and then he
Yeah.
might have like formed it on his own, but like culture helped him inherit that too. Because like
Yes.
the God I see talked about in America
Yes.
is not the same God that my parents seem to talk about.
Mm-hmm.
And like that's a very interesting thing that he'll have to like navigate as he gets older. Like, are those one and the same? And like I think we'd argue it's like God is God. But it's like when you're growing up, it's like you're taught, not even like Christians are so funny too, because like there's Presbyterian God and there's Lutheran God and there's Methodist
And
God.
there's Mormon God.
There's non-denom God, you know, and it's like we'd all say it's the same, but really we're like, we think our God is
Yeah.
a little different. And I think that's, we've not really touched that on the pod, really, like the denominational differences and faith differences. But I do think that's an interesting thing. It's like we kind of have our own version of that,
Yeah,
where we think our God is the right God.
for sure. And I think that it's, well, first off, it's a natural human thing to like make our God look like ourselves. But I think that learning that we do that is the best way to, you know, try and expand our view. Like, I've heard the thought, or I don't know, this is just a quote that says like, there's no such thing as just like theology. Like every person's theology has to have a like an adjective in front of it. So like my theology would be like cisgendered white woman, Gen Z.
Yeah.
Like, because I can't take those things. I can't remove myself from those qualifiers. So like, yes, like that my theology is going to be affected by who I am. But if I recognize that, then I can work on expanding that, you know?
Yeah, I was just thinking about that. I'm in this era currently of a lot of debating on TikTok. I always say that my follower like increase has like kind of died down, but the hate comments are through the roof. You'd think that there'd be a direct
So you've got all the views.
I'm getting a lot of views.
Yeah.
I'm getting a lot of DMs.
Oh.
And most of them are pretty nice. And
That's
a lot
good.
of them are stories of people like, hey, like someone just messaged me the other day, like I was delivered from my homosexuality, but I'm like, and I was so happy, and now I'm like not, like I'm still attracted to women, and it's like maybe I wasn't delivered from this. Like, what do I do about this? And she's like, I think I'm a lesbian. I was like, I think you might be, right?
I think you might be too.
And I'm like, I'm always like, I'm not a therapist.
Yeah.
But I can tell you that I don't believe that God hates you for loving people of the same gender.
Right.
But yeah, there's the whole reason I brought that up was to say, like, I was just talking to someone about that. I was like, we have to understand that inherited beliefs, even theologically, we're inheriting theology from other people. They're like, so Paul's theology was a first century straight dude, maybe like guy that is going through his thing. But then like you look at like Calvin, like John Calvin and Wesley and any of the other people that are like, and then we get to us today. It's like we have our lens, and that's I think another way of saying like inherited beliefs. It's like I can't not read the Bible as a 35-year-old white guy who lived in a progressive city and now lives in a more moderate to conservative state. That like everything about the way I view it is through my lens, and I think we oftentimes pretend like that's not real.
Yeah,
and that does a huge disservice to us growing individually spiritually, but like it completely shuts down any discourse and dialogue, because then we're like, well, that doesn't matter, but it does, because like what you're reading is not the objective truth. It's what someone wrote down with their biases, talking about theology. I'm not even talking about the Bible right now, like talking about systemic theology and stuff like that.
Okay.
Like people writing down their theology, it's like they wrote it from their vantage point, and we have to think about that.
Yes. And I think to piggyback on that, it doesn't mean that we don't listen to them. It just means that we do need to think we listen to them, but we also recognize that they are a product of their lens.
Yeah, and it's like one thing that I've made a practice that I don't know if it's good or not, but I know a lot of people don't. I listen to people I don't agree with a lot, like whether it's sermons or podcasts. Like I try to consume content that I know I won't naturally agree with, because I want to be able to better understand other people's perspectives and maybe learn. Like, I ask myself a lot, like, am I actually right in the things I believe? And I don't always know that there's a binary right or wrong, but I spend a lot of time wrestling with that tension. I carry it like very heavily. And so because of that, like, I try to surround myself with as much counter information as I can to try to create a full picture. And we've talked about this a lot on the pod. Like, one of the things I think we inadvertently do in deconstruction, and Emily's done this and I've done this and you've probably done this, is we put ourselves in an echo chamber of like people that agree with us. And that's probably just as dangerous on the progressive side as it is on the conservative side, on the pre-deconstruction or post. Like, echo chambers to themselves are never healthy, no matter what forms them, I would argue. Like, they never really end up being that beneficial. You just insulate yourself from anyone you disagree with.
Right. I think that like any ideology that's insistent that its way is the only way is spooky scary.
Yeah, and I talked about this with someone, actually. I brought you up in a conversation with a new family at the well. Like, your message when I was gone about, well, this wasn't exactly what it was about, but you talked about how, like, the fear of progressivism becoming a new version of fundamentalism, or like progressive fundamentalism, and like trying to avoid that.
Yeah.
And it's like, we can be fundamentalist about anything. You can be a deconstruction fundamentalist. You could be a fundamentalist about anything. And it's like, trying to avoid that is important. So, we're getting close to an hour, and so I want to land us. And so I don't know. We did very little pre-work to talk about this. We're just jumping back in. But maybe a fun way to end this is back to some of the origins of what we did early on, which was like giving encouragement to someone on the deconstruction journey. And your voice is new to this, and so and we just taken a break. So, like, what encouragement would you give to someone that's maybe step 1 through 10, and like they're just getting into deconstruction?
So they're babes.
They're babies.
They're
in the
babies.
deconstruction. Like, at this point, it's still exciting, probably, but also really intimidating and fearful.
Yeah, I think I'm so proud of anyone who's willing to look at their beliefs and just the choice to really dive into that is really scary, but also really wonderful and lovely. And advice, you say?
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm just like hyping you up. Advice.
Compliments can be advice.
Compliments. And I think don't be afraid to like talk about it with trusted people too, or just be like, hey, I might have a new thought or something. Because anytime that I've ever shared a new thought with someone that I trust, like, they've surprised me in a really nice way. Yeah. So.
Yeah, I dig that. I would say similarly, I think it's like, find people that you can talk to. Because eventually you're going to have to talk it out. Like, it has to get outside of just yourself.
Right.
And I've seen you do that with the friends that you have. And like, I know we've talked about stuff. Emily, the same thing. But it's like, the one thing about, and I don't, like, we're not going to always be like Emily a minute, but like, one of the things I appreciate,
I will.
one of the things I appreciate about her and her journey was, it wasn't just me, and it wasn't just you, it wasn't just Dustin, but it was like, she had lots of other people and kind of eclectic voices.
Yeah.
And those served her really well. And I think the number one value I would encourage people to look for is simply people you trust, and that are going to let you explore, because that's what this is. It's an exploration. And if you can't trust the people that you're exploring with, you're never really going to explore. And so it's like, find people that you trust, even if they don't agree with you, and like, they're like not Christians, like, but you trust them enough to share what you believe, or maybe they're really conservative, but they trust you enough and you trust them enough where they're not going to beat you over the head, or maybe they're really progressive, but whoever they are, it's like, trust is going to be the thing, regardless of where they are theologically or philosophically, that I think is going to like give you the most ability to have enjoyment, because it's going to be hard, but also like, I think it will fill up your tank stamina wise for when it does get hard, if you've built some of those lifelines of trust as you start it.
Yeah. Because and a lot of times those people aren't super, like, or at least in my experience, I'm not reaching out or chatting with people about maybe this new thing that I'm thinking or whatever for the sake of debate, you know, and the
Right.
people that I talk to, like, they know that's the case, that it's more just like we're just sharing and kind of getting things out in the open, and it's more about that and less about like
Yeah, find
that.
yourself listeners, right? Like people that are going to try to convince you of something. Now, I know there's a lot of people, and that's usually not the road I take in any like sort of pastoral conversation. There are certain things I feel really strongly about, but especially if someone is like deconstructing, I think in a pastoral sense for like you and I, like if a pastor is listening and someone's in deconstruction, like I think listening is the best thing you can do.
Yes. Yeah.
And like playing, this makes it sound more calculated, but playing the slow game, not being like, I have to like win this person over. It's like, trust God and trust the Holy Spirit's guidance and like just listen and be a friend and add advice and add wisdom and add truth where you can. But where I watch a lot of these things get derailed and trust get like burned is where the person, especially in the pastoral side of the conversation, they immediately jump on the defensive and they try to win you back over.
Yeah.
They try to tell you why you're wrong or why you're deceived. And it's like, trust that God is with them. Like the same thing you said 20 minutes ago. It's like God was with you at the beginning and God is with you now. And it's like, as a pastor, wouldn't you trust that the most, right? And be the least fearful of that.
Right.
And
like,
sometimes it seems like pastors are fearful that God's even with that person, right?
Yeah. I mean, realistically, they're probably fearful that they're going to find like a better and more sustainable theology post deconstruction.
Sure.
And it might not be, and it might feel threatening, but overall.
I think that's maybe our next episode, because you and I have an interesting lens on this. Like as people, we're both church insiders, whether no matter how cool we think we are, we're church insiders.
Womp womp.
Womp womp is true. And it might be interesting for us to talk about, like with real honesty, like some of the things that we're fearful of, because even though I hold things really open-handedly, I still have things that I'm like, I'm fearful of.
Sure.
And then maybe it might be a shorter episode, but it might be interesting to like dive into.
I don't think so. I think
they'll all be longer ones.
Yeah.
Well, friends, this was fun. Sadie, I think this is going to be a fun journey. I'm excited. Episode 1 down. But though the co-host has changed, we're going to keep the ending the same. Do you remember the tag to end our show?
Yeah.
You do? All
is
right.
it embrace the journey?
But we got to say it together.
Oh. Mobby, sorry. Okay.
Well, hey, friends, thanks for joining us. And don't forget to
embrace the journey. Oh, you snap after?
We're going to have to work on this.
Okay,
But
sorry.
We'll see you around, friends.
Bye-bye. Wow, we're so endearing.